All right. Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, How to Navigate Recruiting Compliance. My name is Alex, your MC today with Namely. We are proud to present this webinar courtesy of Namely and Hired. For a couple of notes here, I just want to let everyone know that this webinar is recorded and you'll be able to access the recording as soon as it's processed. We usually send it out, I would say, about 60 minutes after, once we get it uploaded to YouTube and send out the email. Additionally, there is a Q&A section in Zoom. Take a minute just to get comfortable in the Zoom UI. You should see a section where you can ask questions, which we'll try to get to after the webinar in the follow-up email. Additionally, this webinar is available for SHRM credit. In order to claim that SHRM credit, you're going to have to stay on for the full hour, as it will not be available in the recording. So stick on. We'll give the SHRM credit at about, I would say, the 45 to 50 minute mark. So just hang tight and we'll get you that, but it won't be available after. All right, so without further ado, let's jump forward to the next slide. We've got a lot of events. Namely does many webinars. Couple coming up you should be able to see on your screen. Snap a screenshot so you can keep the URL, but we'll also distribute these after. One that I'm particularly excited about, how to align HR and IT to streamline employee onboarding. We're doing that with our partner Okta. And we have an interesting blend of IT and HR professionals on that webinar. And the topic, honestly, has saved our HR team hours of admin work with every new hire. On the left-hand side, you can also see we do some in-person events. So if you're in the Bay Area, come out and meet the Namely team on July 25th. And I believe Hired has an event in Seattle on the 24th, or actually, cross that out. That's actually us as well. So we're in Seattle. So come out if you're in the Pacific Northwest and meet the Namely team. All right. So let's jump in. I'll just give through a quick agenda here. Actually, do we want to introduce the speakers first? No. Let's do the agenda. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to navigate social media and recruiting compliance, a really hot topic. I know personally, friends always ask me if they should hide their Facebook profiles, and I think we've got some interesting information to talk about today. Additionally, we're talking about discrimination in the recruiting process, salary history, which is also my friends ask me a lot about. How do I negotiate a higher salary? So we'll talk about some things you can and cannot talk about. Another emerging trend in HR compliance is ban the box. Our very own Andy Prstansky has a lot of experience in this topic, and we'll touch on this. Additionally, we'll dive into credit history. I didn't even know that was a part of recruiting compliance, but that's an interesting one to bring to the table. And lastly, another emerging trend here is E-Verify. So with that, I want to jump in and introduce our presenters today. First, we have Amanda Herbert, who's on the marketing team here at Namely and manages the social media with our partners. I think she's got some interesting tidbits to talk about when it comes to social media and the recruiting process. And next, we have Namely's own beat writer, Andy Prstansky, senior HR content specialist here at Namely. He is all over HR compliance in Washington and runs the HR News blog. If you haven't been to it, go to hrnews.namely.com and subscribe to get updates every Friday. So moving on, I do want to give a disclaimer that actually looks like my dog here. In all seriousness, the content of this presentation is provided for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Always consult with employment counsel before taking action on any of the advice given today. So let's jump right in. I'm going to pass it over to Amanda, who's going to touch on some social media in the recruiting process topics.
Yes, thanks, Alex. So quickly going into social media, Just naturally, it's extremely tempting to do research on candidates using social media, whether that's Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. But we want to make a strong point that LinkedIn truly is the only source of social media that we should be using when we're researching candidates. That's really the only source of social media that has anything to do with a job candidate's skills that are required for the job. So a few statistics that we wanted to share. A study was conducted by SHRM that found that 84% of employers used social media to recruit job candidates. That's a huge number. And nearly half of those use social media profiles or online searches to screen applicants. So from these stats, we can see that social media really is being used quite frequently in the recruiting process. So what's the issue here? So taking a look at an applicant on social media likely will reveal protected characteristics, whether we want them to or not. So some of these are their race, their religion, their sexual orientation, their medical condition, to name a few. These are not permitted when making recruiting and hiring decisions. And as a result, we want to refrain from using social media as much as possible, again, unless it is that LinkedIn platform. So a few tips. How do you actually avoid the legal pitfalls? So first of all, only using social media aimed towards professional interactions. Again, choosing LinkedIn over Instagram, for example. If you are going to search social media, try to do so after you've already met that candidate face-to-face. So maybe after they've come in for the interview, checking out their LinkedIn to verify their skills that they mentioned during that interview process. Thirdly, conducting the same searches for all candidates. We want to make sure that we're treating all candidates on the same level. Fourth, do not use the information received as a background check. We want to be sure that we're using a reliable third party for this. A social media search just simply is not considered a formal background check. Have the recruiters and not the hiring managers do the research. The recruiters likely have a little bit more information in regards to social media compliance, so make sure that we're having the recruiters versus the hiring managers doing that research. And then lastly, do not request passwords or access to private social media, as this is illegal in some states. Alrighty, so now moving on to discrimination, our next topic of compliance. So we want to touch on a few protected classes. So the federal protected classes that we have listed here that we want to ensure that we're refraining from when making hiring decisions: age, specifically above 40, disability, genetic information, their national origin, pregnancy, their race or color of their skin, religion, and sex. The EEOC includes gender identity, and sexual orientation as well in regards to that sexual protected class. So now moving on to reasonable accommodation. Employers are required to provide a reasonable accommodation to enable their applicants to be considered for a job opening. Now, naturally, applicants may have a long list of accommodations that they may have, so there certainly are limits when we speak of this. So an employer does not have to provide a specific accommodation if it would cause undue hardship to the company. Now, if it would cause undue hardship to the company, the employer still is required to provide another accommodation that does not, to make up for that undue hardship accommodation that they cannot accommodate. So going on to what you can ask or can say during the interview process. You are able to ask about an applicant's ability to perform specific job duties. So for example, if they would have to lift heavy boxes, you're able to ask the question on certain weightlifting requirements. You're also able to ask about non-medical qualifications and skills. This may be anything such as their education, their work history, any licenses or certifications that are required to perform the job duties. And then you're also able to ask applicants to describe how they would perform these certain tasks. Now, on the other hand, what you should not be asking or should not say during the interview process, anything related to disability or appearance related questions, and then anything tied to those protected classes that I mentioned before. Those are questions such as, are you considering starting a family? Which year did you graduate from high school, which would give that age? Does your family have a history of cancer? All of these questions have nothing to do typically with the job at hand. So some tips on avoiding discrimination and dealing with that unnecessary information that may come unexpectedly during the interview process. So one, simply ignore it. If someone provides you information that discloses a protected class, ignore it. Do not write it down on any notes, emails, or any documents. Don't share it with any other members that may be hiring or a member of the hiring team or recruiting process. Do not use this information in any hiring decisions or recommendations. And then any written notes that you make should be concise, job related, and again, not include any impermissible information. Now I'm going to pass on the reins to Andy, who's going to cover salary history.
Great. Thanks so much, Amanda, for the intro, and really an exciting presentation we have for everybody today. So, we've talked about a lot of different protected traits and qualities so far, things like race, ethnicity, gender, but more and more now, we're starting to see this new protected trait come up, salary history. So for context, why are we all of a sudden limiting salary history questions? Well, if we look at the study recently done by Hired, they found that 63% of the time men are offered higher salaries than women. In conjunction with that, women are offered 4% less than men for the same role, with some offering up to 45% less than men. So this fits in with the broader picture with what we've seen nationally. The numbers vary by age group, but if you focus on 20 to 25-year-olds, that pay gap is 97 cents to the dollar. As women age and they're in their 40s, the gap can increase to 80 cents to the dollar. So lawmakers have been aware of this, and over the past few years, we've seen equal pay laws come to fruition at the federal and state and local level, but they haven't really been able to get much traction on eliminating the gap. So people have figured out that basically if nothing changes at this point, we won't be able to neutralize the pay gap until 2059. So naturally, lawmakers have been looking for other alternative ways to combat the pay gap. So enter the salary history theory. So if you use salary history to determine future compensation, doesn't that in effect perpetuate existing disparities, right? So this theory came about first in Massachusetts and then has spread to a number of states, including New York, California, and in a few major cities like New York City. And the supposed solution here is that if you limit access to salary history, compensation is determined on objective things like what the market rate of the job is, as opposed to something as trivial as what the person's simply used to making. So, out of all the things that I've seen nationally across employment trends, salary history bans really are probably the hottest thing going on right now in employment law. So just some quick tips that we want to touch on regarding salary history and recruiting. So first off, you really should be transparent about compensation early on. If you're providing this information up front to the employee or to the candidate, you don't have to worry about necessarily making it all the way to the final stage of the interview only to find out that you weren't able to meet their salary needs. The other thing that you really need to be mindful of is asking about expectations, right? So some of these laws are specific in that while they limit your access to salary history, you can still ask about what the person is hoping to earn, right? What their expectations are. Now, this varies depending on what state and city you're in, so you have to be mindful of that. And I would actually advise not asking about expectations because there's a very good chance that that person will end up disclosing what they currently earn. So I would advise against that. Last but not least, keep in mind that some of these salary history bans also extend to former employees, right? So you'll often be in a situation where you have to confirm that an individual worked for your company. Now, more often than not, that verification of employment may include what their salary was. So in certain jurisdictions, you also can't disclose that information. So always keep a close eye on what your state and local laws are regarding salary history. All right, so the next topic is ban the box. Now, if you don't know what ban the box is referring to, we're about to give you an education in the role of criminal history in recruiting. So the ban the box movement emerged as sort of a response to the fact that callback rates for ex-offenders have been found to be 50% lower. And when you actually look at the broad US population, nearly a third of it has some form of criminal history, right? Most of these are minor offenses, but they're things that would show up on a background check. So in response, activist groups and state lawmakers have rallied to limit the sort of traditional question you've seen on job applications: have you ever been convicted of a crime? So that's the ban the box movement in a nutshell. And actually, we don't have this bullet here, but it's really important to know that the majority of US citizens now actually live in a ban the box jurisdiction. This is really had a lot of time to gain traction at every level of lawmaking. And I think this is just going to be something that we see more of in the coming years. So as we mentioned, 31 states and over 150 cities have some form of ban the box on the books. You know, all of these have their own varying requirements. Some apply simply just to government offices. Some may be just to contractors. But more often than not, now we're seeing private employers impacted as well. The timing is also something to consider, right? When are you asking about criminal history? So some of the laws mandate that you can't ask about it at all. Others allow employers to inquire about criminal history after they've extended the conditional offer. And another thing to consider is that under federal law, there are certain roles that you have to run background checks on. So positions involving childcare, certain security positions as well. And all of the ban the box laws have carve-outs in them permitting you to run these background checks without any sort of ill effect. So let's wrap with some quick tips on ban the box. So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, you have to be mindful about timing. State and cities vary on this, so be very familiar with what your local jurisdiction mandates. Keep in mind that if you are going to run a background check, you really should be transparent with candidates from the start, right? You don't want to have somebody go through the entire process just to you know, be surprised that they have some sort of record that would limit their eligibility for the role, just to be fair to them. If you end up rescinding an offer due to a background check, you really need to find a clear link between what's on the record and what the role is, right? So for example, if you're a blog writer like myself, and somebody, you know, I have a history with, you know, maybe I have a DUI or something, you would have to clearly explain the connection there, right? If you're hiring a CFO and they have a history of money laundering, then that's a clear connection between the law and the role. So be ready to document and justify any sort of decision that you make there. And last but not least, follow federal developments very closely on this. This is somewhat of a rarity when it comes to employment law. It's a bipartisan issue. There are staunch ban the box supporters on both the Democratic side and the Republican side. So I would not necessarily be surprised to see a federal mandate in the near future. So keep an eye open for that. we covered a lot of the essentials so far, but there are a lot of unique state and local laws and even federal laws that kind of defy classification in a presentation like this. So let's just get started by talking about credit history, right? So similar to salary history, credit history has emerged as this sort of new quasi-protected trait. You know, and actually asking about credit history is not that rare. According to SHRM, 47% of teams look at credit history. Now there's a federal law on the books regarding this, the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And this simply requires that you get the candidate's permission before pulling their credit history report. And also this a little known provision, but you also have to provide them with the results. Now, that said, those protections don't go beyond just the basics. State and local lawmakers, however, have. Employer access to credit history is limited in California, Colorado, Delaware, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, and a slew of other states. And at the city level, it's even more common. New York City and DC are just two of the cities that limit your access to credit history. And again, it's a question of, do you really need to know credit history? If it's something that you aren't going to value that highly for a specific role, chances are it's not worth the risk of asking to begin with. So, you know, we'll follow this closely, but at the state and city level, I see a lot of movement here for credit history. All right, moving on to E-Verify. So most of us are familiar with E-Verify as an onboarding tool, right? It's what you use to cross-reference when an employee puts on their I-9 form. But over the years, what we've seen is some employers have used it as a pre-screening tool, illegally, I might add. It's not something that the USCIS actually allows or permits. So one thing I really want to hit home here is that you cannot use E-Verify in any way prior to hiring the individual. Certain states have varying penalties on this, but California has the staunchest penalties of them all. $100,000 per violation. There was actually a farm not too long ago that got caught using E-Verify on 64 of its employees. Now, you can do the math there. That adds up to quite a bit. So this is easily somewhere where your penalties can add up if you're not careful. So do not use E-Verify as a pre-screening tool. It was never meant for that purpose. And now we've got a truly bizarre topic here, lie detector test. Believe it or not, there was a need to pass this law, the Employee Polygraph Protection Act. This is a federal law that limits employer access to any sort of lie detector process for either prospective or current employees. You know, this is, Maury would not be proud of you if you use this as part of your screening process. Now, oddly enough, there are some exceptions to this. If you're in a security service firm or the pharmaceutical industry, depending on the position, you may be allowed to use a lie detector test. But again, what's the actual use of it? You know, again, we're not lawyers, but at the same time, I'd ask you, what do you gain out of running these tests on employees? So lie detector tests, one of the more unusual parts of employment law, but it is certainly a part of the recruiting process. So be mindful of that. All right, so we've covered a lot. Here are just some parting tips that kind of sum up what we've discussed. So again, you know, we've hit this point home repeatedly, but state and city requirements are nuanced. There's a lot of different provisions depending on where you are. You really need to work with local counsel that's well-versed in what your specific jurisdiction allows and doesn't allow. You know, employment law is one of the fastest evolving areas of all, and you need to stay on top of these trends by subscribing to things like blogs and newsletters. There are plenty of legal firms that have great publications out. I'm a big fan of Jackson Lewis, as well as Littler, Mendelsohn. But also kind of close to home, you can also subscribe to HR News, Namely's own compliance source, and you can see that by going to hrnews.namely.com. And last but not least, don't forget that some of these laws actually have posting requirements, right? And we tend to think of posting requirements as a current employee only thing, right? So things like, you know, the FLSA is the law poster. We all assume that this is something that needs to be in plain sight only to current employees. Oftentimes, if it's a law that touches the recruiting process, that also needs to be visible to candidates as well. So, you know, there are plenty of great resources here. We actually have a employment law poster guide on Namely, but there are other resources provided by SHRM and other HR groups. So always be mindful of posting requirements and how they can also apply to prospective employees.
All right, thank you, Andy. So, all right, if you're interested in learning more, as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, it was brought to you by Namely and Hired. Namely, where Andy is from, is an all-in-one HR payroll and benefits platform created to help mid-sized companies build a better workplace. And the cool thing about Namely is it brings all these in one place and makes compliance super, super easy. We hear all the time about HR professionals saving hours of admin work each week because it's all under one roof. Additionally, thank you, Hired, for participating in this webinar. Hired is a career marketplace that intelligently matches tech talent with the world's most innovative companies. They combine cutting-edge technology and unbiased career coaching so both talent and employers can find the right fit faster. They're on a mission to find everyone a job they love. We appreciate the work Hired does every day, and thank you for being a part of today's webinar. So before we continue to the SHRM credit, I just want to take the time to run a poll. If you're interested in getting a demo from either Namely or Hired, you should see the options pop up on your screen right now. You can say yes to either or yes to both at the same time. So I'll pause there for about 30 seconds before moving on to the SHRM certification code, which I'll leave up for the remainder of this webinar. All right, so got some interest there. If you did mark your interest for a demo, we will follow up with you via email after this webinar.